thank you, everybody, obviously, just for being here. This is not my first time at Rowan. This is a bit of a post-election tradition. Always enjoy it. Covered, New Jersey, as you heard, when I first got out of college, first got into the media world. And I always tell people about 3 years of covering New Jersey state politics. The best stories, some of the best memories, best characters, unquestionably. Just a lot of fond memories here. There's some of the memories were professionally there were some interesting encounters too. I always tell people I don't even know if the name Bob Torricelli, some people here will remember the name. It's a feisty fellow, and I learned quickly. I interviewed him. He's one of the first people I interviewed during his 2002 re-election campaign that he ended, and I could say I learned a lot very quickly interviewing Bob Torricelli. But yeah, no, just great memories. So from New Jersey to the national pictures, what I'm mainly going to talk about here, although, and this is, I always get happy when we're doing, elections, a midterm, a presidential, anything I'm doing on air. This year, obviously, in the run up to the presidential, I just lived basically on the air in 7 states, the 7 battleground states. You probably know them all by heart: Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona. And that was like it. It was like the election wasn't happening in the other 43 states. And yet on election night, sometime around 10 o'clock, I think, my producer started flagging Hudson County, New Jersey, and Passaic County, New Jersey. And I'll show you a little bit, from there in a minute. I think you all know the stories, but I got to do New Jersey County breakdowns on the air, which I look for chances to do that. I rarely get them in the national coverage, but I got to this year. So always fun when I get to do a throwback to the Garden State. So in terms of this election and sort of what happened, kind of how it happened, what it looks like on the map, put a number of slides together here. Just kind of wanted to go through, I think, to give you a sense of how I look at, how this played out, how this took shape. I'm not used to not just touching the board to move things, so we'll see. We'll see if this works. Let's give it a shot. So I'm going to go through, first of all, just in terms of the shifts. I think the key here is the shifts from 2020, the Biden-Trump election, to 2024, what we just had. And these are from the exit polls, which have been updated several times. They come in. You might have seen them when the polls closed on election night, or even before the polls closed. We start putting exit poll results on the air. More people are interviewed that night. Once the results come in, the exit polls are adjusted further. So you're looking now sort of at close to the final readout on these. And I wanted to go through some of the shifts because I think these are all interesting in some way. Gender gap, first of all. And I think this one is worth pausing on because 2 things are, I think, notable about this from my standpoint. Number one is just the gender gap itself, which is basically just the difference. Trump won men, you could see there, by 12. Harris won women by 8. 12, 8, it's a 20-point gender gap. Now, that's high. That's one of the highest we've had, on record. 1980 is really the first election where we saw this, big time, a gender gap in a presidential election. We've basically, with kind of one exception, we've had it ever since. This would be the 3rd highest gender gap since 1980. However, a lot of the polling before the election and a lot of the commentary before the election, and honestly, a lot of the hopes of Democrats before the election involved this gap being much bigger, this gap shattering the record. The record was 24 coming into this year, going past 24, maybe going past 30 points. Now, from the Democrat standpoint, they believe that would be fueled by a dynamic like we saw in 2020. There you can see the 23-point gender gap. And in 2020, it redounded to the Democrats' advantage there. Among women, just slightly more than 50% of the electorate, 15-point advantage for Biden in 2020. Among men, only half for Trump. So you could see how the math there clearly benefited the Democrats. And the Democrats believe that same dynamic was still in effect, first of all, that there was going to be a larger Democratic victory margin among women then there was a Trump victory margin among men. And they believed it was going to be a lot more than that. And they believed that was going to be because primarily of what happened in 2022, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, the Dobbs decision. Abortion was returned as a political matter to the states. And Democrats believed that was going to cause the biggest gender gap we'd ever seen, and that it was going to be, you see, it was basically the margin in 2020 was about twice among women as it was among men. They were talking about something even bigger than that this time. Obviously, it didn't happen. 20 points compared to expectations the Democrats had. 20 points actually is kind of a meh number. And then look, it actually ends up being, and this is something that Republicans were actually saying, and this is actually what played out. If you talk to the Trump people during the campaign, they felt they were going to get more out of men than Democrats were going to get out of women. They felt, and you saw this, I think, in terms of why the male number went into double digits for the Republicans. The point of emphasis the Trump folks were making was with young men in particular. And the Joe Rogan podcast, the UFC fights that Trump was going to, a lot of the visuals, the sort of public events that Trump was doing. It was designed, in their view, they believed there was an opening among men, particularly younger men, but then also, and we'll get to this too, also younger non-white men. They thought that there was a way through some cultural issues, through some sort of cultural positioning. They felt there was a way in with male voters and with non-white voters, some inroads that hadn't been possible or realized by Republicans in the past. The broad way of saying what they were telling us was going to happen was that there was a backlash. In their view, there would be a backlash to, again, broadly speaking, this is how they would say it, woke culture. They would say that there are young men out there who are alienated from sort of what's the kind of the dominant culture in the country that comes through media, that sort of media, political institutions, that sort of thing, and that would express itself here. And I think, there is, and we'll show some other numbers later. I think there is something to that. When you look at younger men, which we will later. On the women's side, that's the other big story here, obviously, is why is that number, that Democratic number, not just not bigger than 2020, but markedly less than 2020? And this is probably a good place to say something about the politics of abortion, where my own view of this is I think Democrats were... and I say Democrats were hoping for this, but also, folks in my industry, I think it was logical. It made logical sense that Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade. There's going to be theoretically, there's going to be this flood of new support by women for Democrats. So that was the expectation that even folks, sort of in the media and the political class had. And I never fully bought into it because the 2022 midterms, which took place, a few months after the Dobbs decision, my reading of them was always a little different than most other folks. And I think about it now because I think it kind of aligns with this a bit. The prevailing sort of take on the 2022 midterms was that there was a Dobbs effect in 2022. The Democrats had done better than expected in 2022. They'd won some Senate races that they didn't expect to. They'd been very competitive at the House level. They didn't win the House, but they came close. And this was because there was a flood of support to them related to the overturning of Roe versus Wade. The things that were cautionary notes in my mind, and that I think we see here again in 2022, where you could look at a number of high-profile races. The key example, I think I talked about it here after the election in 2022. What has stuck in my mind since 2022 is Georgia. And Georgia in the 2022 midterm, they had two marquee competitive races where just floods of national money came in. Everybody, the governor's race and the Senate race. And the Senate race was Herschel Walker was the Republican, Raphael Warnock was the Democrat, and the governor's race was Brian Kemp was the Republican, Stacey Abrams was the Democrat. Abrams had come about 50,000 votes from winning in 2018, was in a rematch with Kemp. Now, in the post-Dobbs atmosphere in which that 2022 campaign was conducted, politically, the office there that had the power on abortion was governor. Governor, abortion is now going to be set at the state level Abortion policy is going to be set at the state level. The governor's race, if abortion is your animating issue, the governor's race is where the action is. You might vote in the Senate race based on abortion, but it's likely the issue is being settled at the state level. And I thought it was an interesting experiment in a way, because Herschel Walker and Brian Kemp had the identical position on abortion in 2022. Both of them favored a 6-week ban. Both of them favored that. Both of them campaigned on it. And Walker lost by 2 points and Kemp won by 8 points. 10-point gap between the two races. So I felt then, looking at that result, that it didn't align with a reading of the 2022 midterms that abortion was the focal issue. It did align with a reading of the 2022 midterms that Trump himself was an issue, and Trump-aligned candidates really were an issue in some key states. Because what you saw in Georgia in 2022 was sort of an outer tier. There's suburbs immediately around Atlanta, and then there's like a second tier of suburbs north of Atlanta. The second tier are the Republican suburbs. They're still Republican. They'd gotten less Republican under Trump. And that's where you saw the big split in 2022. They voted for Brian Kemp. If you remember, Brian Kemp at the time was in like a political feud with Donald Trump. That feud made these voters comfortable with Brian Kemp. Herschel Walker was Trump's handpicked candidate for the Senate. That made these voters very uncomfortable with Herschel Walker. That's where you saw the split. And we saw this in other states too in 2022. Iowa, a Republican governor, Kim Reynolds, 6-week ban, reelected in a landslide. Ohio, Mike DeWine, again, abortion restrictions, Democratic opponent, the mayor of Dayton, who made abortion her main issue, lost in a landslide. So we saw that disconnect in 2022. So I think part of this is, I think there was a misread going into this election of how the abortion issue was playing out post-Roe. I think the good year, relatively speaking, the Democrats had in 2022 was more a product of some specifically Trump-aligned candidates like Walker, in Arizona, Carrie Lake. I think the Trump-aligned candidates cost the Republicans a number of Senate races in 2022, but might have created the perception that something bigger was happening there, and it wasn't. So I think that our baseline assumption about that was wrong. And then when you start looking at issues, when you start asking voters, what issues animated you in this election, I think and I don't have the number for it here, but I can tell you, I think when you looked at women, two things that aligned were, in the exit poll, we gave 3 options on basically, what do you think broadly should be the law on abortion? Legal in all cases, legal in no cases, somewhere in between. Now, most people chose somewhere in between. Most women were on somewhere in between, but legal, but some restrictions essentially. Women who answered that and who had a negative view about where the economy stood, about the cost of living and about where the economy stood, they moved massively in Trump's direction. And so, I think there's a tier of voter there. We've seen a number of statewide referendums on abortion where generally the pro-choice side has passed. We've seen this in red states. We've seen this in blue states. But my read on this is just because somebody's pro-choice and just because somebody will go out and vote in favor of one of those referendums, I think there's pretty strong evidence that the issue is not that central to them. There are voters who the abortion issue is central for. I think my read on it is these voters basically were Democrats already. And so I don't think it moved the needle politically. So that's a long way of addressing the gender gap, which I think, again, it's one of the, surprises to a lot of people. There was a gender gap. It wasn't as big as we were expecting. And the Republicans benefited more from the gender gap than the Democrats. That's not something we're used to saying. Now take a look here. Again, we're talking about shifts from 2020 to 2024. And this is, by race and ethnicity. So among white voters, Trump won double digits both times. He actually lost a little ground among white voters. White voters are a little bit more than 2/3 of the overall electorate, just around 70%. And Trump wins that group, but actually loses a couple points. Black voters, there was a lot of talk about this during the campaign, and there were polls that showed this is a constituency that for 60 years has been a core Democratic constituency. Since 1964, there is no Republican who has hit 20% even of the black vote in a presidential election. Now, there was polling this year that was suggesting Trump was making up some ground there. The exit poll shows very little. I mean, you can see it 75 to 73. Now, there was in the exit poll a bit of a gender gap that developed, among African Americans, where Trump actually got 20% of the black male vote, according to the exit polls here, much lower with black women. And the other thing that I think is worth noting on this is in these exit polls, again, if white voters are nearly 70% of the electorate, black voters just over 10%. So when you're dealing with these exit polls, even with something massive as an exit poll, there's a little bit more room with groups that are 10, 12% of the electorate than a group that's like 70% of the electorate. There's a little bit more room for that number to be more of an estimate and less of an exact, precise number. And I say that because some precinct analysis, you can do some precinct analysis and some overwhelmingly black precincts in various states where you do see a little bit more movement in this. Now, I'm not talking 20, 30 points, but you do see a little bit more movement in this. So it's 2 in the exit polls. I suspect it was a little bit more than that, but I don't think it was massive. But I do think that the takeaway going forward is I think we might be seeing the outlines there. And again, this gets to the increased Republican support among men. I do think we might be seeing more of a gender gap emerging as something to look for in the future potentially among black voters. Now, go to Hispanic voters, and I mean, the number speaks for itself. Look at that. From a 33-point win for Joe Biden among Hispanic voters to just 5 points in the exit poll. And again, the polling had been suggesting all year that Trump was putting up historically high numbers for a Republican among Hispanic voters. This is the number that Trump landed at here ultimately is the highest recorded in an exit poll for a Republican with Hispanic voters. George W. Bush in 2004, very close to the Trump number, although again, in 2004, the Hispanic population as a share of the electorate much lower than it is now. And so again, even in 2004, the exit poll says Bush got 44% of the Hispanic vote. That's a rougher estimate than what you're looking at now when the Hispanic population is almost 4 times the size as it was as a share of the electorate. And the movement, again, it's massive. I'll take you through some of the counties where you can really see this the most dramatically in a minute. But that, a group that's getting close now to 15% of the electorate, that kind of a shift is enormous among Asian Americans. And again, if you could see here from 27 for Biden, that was his victory margin among Asian Americans, down to 15 this year. If you went back one more election there to 2016, the number among Asian Americans then would have been over 40 points. So it's a Trump era decline in terms of Democratic support from Asian Americans. And again, the Asian American population growing, not at the level that the Hispanic population is, but it is growing. Put this all together, and basically 1/3 of the non-white vote was won by Donald Trump. And as a share of the overall of Trump's overall coalition nationally, there's never been a Republican presidential candidate whose coalition percentage-wise has been as the non-white concentration of that coalition has never been as high in a presidential race as what we're seeing right here in 2024 with Donald Trump. So that's a very significant shift, obviously, for this year. But again, this is a trend, especially among Hispanics and Asian Americans, that we already started to see in 2020. One of the takeaways in 2020 was that Trump was doing better among Hispanic voters. So the implications for this for the future, I think this is what Democrats, a lot of people look at this election and they say, well, Trump won, but look, it was, Harris was pretty close in those 3 Midwest states. If she'd won them, she wins the election. The popular vote's going to be, a little bit under a 1.5 difference between them. Not that bad of an election, big picture for Democrats, even though they didn't win. You hear that, but you also talk to Democrats who think this is worse for them because of the fear that this is going to get worse for them going forward. If these trends continue, the combination of a rising non-white population, particularly a rising Hispanic, Asian American population, and more drift away from Democrats and toward Republicans, that can alter the landscape pretty significantly. And it came close to in some places this year. Again, we'll get to here in a minute. Again, looking among Latinos, you see a gender gap that's developing here. I mean, take a look at this. In 2020, men and women, male and female, Hispanic, both more than 20 points. There was a gender gap then. You can see there's 16 points. But look at that. Now, Trump cut his deficit among Hispanic women more than in half, from 39 to 19. But how about that? Among men, he won. Trump won Hispanic men by 11 points in this election. And again, there's also, don't have it here, but there's also an age gap. You know, under 50, if you use over 50, under 50 as the cutoff. Hispanic men under 50, Trump even better than that. And again, this gets to his campaign was talking about that strategy. They believe that more sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of cultural issues, cultural themes, cultural posturing, however you define it, they thought that was their way in to the non-white vote, particularly through men. I think you see some more evidence of that right here. Take a look. Here we go. I think this is also significant. This is the first time we've seen this. You know, the Republican Party typically, certainly when I was growing up, the image of the Republican Party was the country club party, you know, the Main Street businessmen, the party of wealth. And the Democratic Party, the main image was this is the blue collar, this is the working class party, this is the union party. So take a look at this here. Use $100,000 as the dividing line here for your income in the past year. 2020, you know, double digits, Trump was still winning 100,000 plus. Double digits, 2020, Biden was winning less than 100,000. That's what we've seen typically in the past. It's been more dramatic than that in the past. And now, look at that, a total reversal. The higher end of the income scale, Democratic. The lower end of the income scale, Republican. And this gets to again, this is a trend we'd been seeing for a while in politics that exploded under Trump. So you're seeing it kind of realized here fully in 2020, or maybe it's not fully, but realized in a way where the Republicans are now winning the lower side of the income divide in 2024. But you could start to see this in 16 and in 20 already. The two groups of white voters, we say they're about 70% of the electorate. You could split them broadly into two groups. One's a little bit larger than the other. The one that's a little bit larger would be blue-collar white voters without a four-year college degree, broadly speaking. And then white voters with a college degree, more of sort of again, generalizing here, but these fairly line up. You're going to find, you know, white-collar professionals, suburbanites, you know, higher income, this sort of thing. They've been becoming more Democratic. So again, if you went back a generation in time, this would be totally reversed. It was a trend that was playing out over time, and when Trump came in, it exploded. And again, this gets to what makes Democrats nervous going forward. Is this the start of a broader, longer term, not just winning the lower income vote for Republicans, but, you know, building a big margin there, because there's more on that side of it. Of that divide. There's more voters on that side than there's the side where the Democrats are now winning. And again, this gets to younger voters. Again, 2020, Joe Biden won voters under 30 by 24 points. That margin cut in half here. Again, if you looked inside this, a lot of this, not all of it, but there's non-white young voters, non-white male young voters. Very big part of this, not the only part, but a significant part of this. Thought this was interesting too, just to point out here, when the campaign ended, where the candidates, just the basic perception of the candidates, favorable, unfavorable. This is from the exit poll. You can see here the two VP candidates about the same. Vance technically with the highest favorable score, but I think the Harris-Trump one on favorable, unfavorable is worth pointing out only because of this. When Harris got in the race at the end of July, the polling then showed that Biden was unpopular, unfavorable, that Trump was unpopular, unfavorable, and that Harris was unpopular. All of them were. So when she got in, one of the questions we were asking was, did the Democrats actually upgrade here? Because she's not that popular when you use this as the metric. Now, in the first 6 weeks or so of her campaign, that changed. She got an enormous amount of positive press. She did not really sit for, intense interviews. She was shielded from the press in a lot of ways. And our poll in mid-September put Harris ahead of Trump nationally, and it was powered by at that point, she had a 16-point jump from when she got in the race in her favorable score. Her favorable was higher than her unfavorable in our September poll. It was a clear advantage over Trump. The launch had been a spectacular success for Harris. It's mid-September. From mid-September on, well, she did some more interviews. There was more she wasn't shielded as much. The campaign a more traditional campaign, so to speak, took over. And on election day, it's back to baseline. Everything that had happened in those first 6 weeks was wiped out, and it's back to baseline. So I thought that was worth pointing out. Some of these trends that I just talked about demographically, I just thought I would show you on the map here. So we're going to go through just a couple states here quickly and point these out. These are kind of fun ones. So Leelanau County, Michigan, you can see there in the lower peninsula, northwest of it. This is a very small county. And I'm pointing this one out because Harris lost Michigan, but she actually, you can see here, did a little bit better in this county than Joe Biden did in 2020. There are very few counties anywhere where Harris did better than Biden in 2020. She did a little bit better here. Why am I singling this one out? Because again, this is what makes Democrats nervous about the coalition they're currently sitting on in the trajectory. This is wine country. This is summer vacation land. There's wineries in Leelanau County. It has the highest median income in Michigan. It's wealthy, retirees, high concentration of college degrees, and wine vineyards. That's what Harris got. That's where she struck a chord and did better than Biden. And there are not many places where she did better at all. And again, when it's that demographically specific, it's got to make a party nervous on top of everything else. Meanwhile, in the southeast part of the state, Wayne County, where Detroit is, this is the motherlode of votes in the state. And for Democrats, they depend. Look, if you could see those numbers. In 2020, Joe Biden won Wayne County. That's a difference of 333,000 votes out of Wayne County. And then you can see here down to just 248,000 for Harris over Trump. From a 38-point Biden win there, you can see to a 29-point Harris win. That's, for Democrats, that is scary, scary slippage. It reflects a whole bunch of things. It reflects that in Detroit, which is a heavily black city, the turnout was down primarily from what Democrats count on out of Detroit. And also it's small. Trump did a little bit better in Detroit. That's where you see some of these precincts, heavily black precincts, where Trump showed more improvement than you see in the exit poll. It speaks to the problems that Democrats had in heavily Muslim Arab cities that are in Wayne County. Dearborn, Michigan, for instance, is there. And then there are also, if you look at the municipality level, the municipalities with the highest populations of Hispanic voters and Asian American voters in Wayne County, Trump was making 10, 15, 20-point gains from 4 years ago. So again, for the Democrats to be trading that kind of a loss, that kind of a diminished support in Wayne County for that kind of an increase in wine country, that is not the side of the equation they want to be on. I point out Lawrence, Massachusetts, too, because I'm from Massachusetts and like New Jersey, I love to get a reference in. Lawrence, Massachusetts is the most heavily Hispanic city in Massachusetts, about 90,000 people, 82% Hispanic. And look at this. Now, Biden won it by 48 4 years ago, comes all the way down to 17. Want to stretch that out even further? I wish I could. 2016, that was a 67-point victory for Hillary Clinton in Lawrence, Massachusetts. In 2 presidential elections with Donald Trump as the Republican nominee in the most heavily Hispanic city in the blue state of Massachusetts, the Democratic margin has dropped 50 points, 5-0. And we see this all over the map in places like, here it is, we'll land on this one, Passaic County, New Jersey. And this is one, I looked at on election night and I did a double take. The idea Trump won Passaic County. The idea of a Republican winning Passaic County in a presidential, I don't need to tell folks in this room, but again, that was You think about that, there's I think several factors. There's obviously large Hispanic population. There's also significant Arab American population, and there's a significant Orthodox population as well. And you could show it to you there. We could show it to you in Lakewood. It could show it to you in New York State. We could show you places with significant Orthodox even in New York City, significant Orthodox populations that went more Republican, that moved towards Trump this time. Passaic's got all three of those as ingredients. And look at that, Trump won Passaic County. He won Bill Pascrell's old congressional district. Nellie Poe is a Trump district Democrat now, which, trust me, I never thought I'd be saying when she got into the race. So that's sort of on the map, those demographic trends that I was outlining from the exit polls. That's what they start to look like on the map. And again, I focus this on, Democrats fearing that this is going to get worse, because I think you can see these trends. That's their fear, is that continues. The hope for Democrats, I would say, and the fear for Republicans and the challenge for Republicans is how much of this is Trump specific? Because I mentioned Nellie Poe, she won. She and Trump both won. Trump's support didn't fully trickle down. Trump won in Michigan. The Democrats won the Senate race in Michigan. Trump won in Wisconsin. Democrats won the Senate race. There are a lot of examples like this. Part of this is there were voters we're starting to see. There were voters who showed up, voted for Trump in the presidential election, and just didn't vote in the other races on the ballot. That helped Democrats a little bit. Can Republicans take those voters who maybe they like Trump's personality? Was it an issue that brought them up? Whatever it was, they were Trump-specific voters. Trump's never going to be on a ballot again. Can Republicans get those folks back just voting for, normal Republicans? And then there's also clearly a share of folks who are traditionally Democratic voters. That could be Hispanic voters in Passaic County. That could be in Wisconsin. There's still some areas where there's blue-collar white voters who Trump won over who still vote Democratic in other races, lower-level races. That's, again, why Tammy Baldwin, part of why she was able to win in Wisconsin. Can Republicans get those folks to take the next step with Trump off the ballot and still vote for Republicans then? I think it's a huge question. It's a huge question going forward because Trump is such a unique figure, and that's the Republicans leave this election obviously happy and feeling they've got a ton of momentum, a ton of demographic momentum, but will it survive without Donald Trump? They haven't had great midterms in 2022 or 2018 without him. Sets up an interesting 2026 or really 2025 because more people are going to be watching New Jersey this time around nationally than last time. Now with that, we'll take some questions.
Steve, thank you for that. We had a bunch of questions that came in. When people registered, you were able to submit a question. A lot of the times, these questions were all sometimes similar in topic, so we kind of had to reduce them to an essence. When you joined us on this stage 2 years ago following the midterm elections, you said, "In the process of preparing, I become aware of how much I don't know." So everybody here thinks you're pretty smart, even if you think you don't know things. And it leads us to this question. Can you just give us if you can, a brief overview of how you prepare to know about counties that I can't even pronounce the name of in Michigan, and how you know who they are, where those people are? How do you prepare to be at the big board on election night? And just curious, did you do anything different this time as opposed to 2 years ago?
Well, I guess the answer in terms of the prep is it's just the general rule of thumb I have is that 99% of what I study heading into an election is never going to make air, but you don't really know what the 1% that makes air is going to be. So you got to study everything. I had basically had a folder for every state, and it's a kind of a running thing. It can happen any time of the year. It could happen 2 years ago, whatever. If I encounter a nugget, a data point, something meaningful I want to remember about a state, I just add it I'll put a note down, or if it's about a county, I have maps. I have, county maps of states in there. I'll circle the county, I'll write the note, and I accumulate them over time. And then really this year I got an earlier start because the primary season ended up being so uneventful. So really starting in the spring this year, I would just devote huge. I mean, it's like being back in school. Students here can relate. Just huge chunks of time to studying. And my producer is great with compiling data, spreadsheets, organizing data. And so we just have reams of, demographic data, census data at the county level, at the municipal level, sometimes at the precinct level, and also voting histories, state, county, municipal, precinct, not precinct everywhere, but where we can get it, it's great. And it's just, I love the research process because for me, it's like, you're kind of learning, you're finding out about the country. This summer, I showed you Leelanau County in Michigan. It was like, I was researching Michigan, and I'm trying to figure out, it had been getting more democratic, why it was. And then I find out there's wine country, and I find out all about this region of Michigan I had no idea about. So actually, I had my 1 week vacation this summer. I went to Leelanau. They got some tourism out of me. So, and I can tell you, it's at Traverse City, Michigan. That's now Leelanau. It's right nearby. Great. It's truly, go out there in the summer. It's a great area. I'll give you recommendations if you're looking. But yeah, it's just, those folders are really thick by the end of the campaign. And then what I developed, I don't know, the last month or two was, I wrote on the folder, break glass in case of emergency, because I had this nightmare that, we're so focused in the 7 battlegrounds. What if I look up and Virginia is a toss-up, or New Mexico? So I had a bunch of states, New Hampshire, which did get super close actually, that I put there, and I had to kind of cram and learn. And then the punchline to all this is I got like a little podium next to the board that you see on the air. Everything that I've done, my life's work is there on election night, and I got a deal, like the podium stays, the board is on until election week or whatever it is over. So I did 17 straight hours on the air, election night to the next morning. I said, okay, I'm going to go take my, nap here, be back. When I came back, podium was gone, folders were gone. And I asked the folks in the studio where they went, and nobody knew. So I lost all my folders. So yeah, that's gonna. Well,
I'm glad you can laugh about it, because I think we all sank. You talked about how when we had a question about surprises, a couple questions. So you talked about, I did a double take when I saw the Passaic County numbers, right? Passaic County, North Jersey. So for those, it's Passaic City, Patterson, heavily, very heavy Hispanic population in that county. The question is, did you see a trend emerging before election night? Did you know something was up on these kinds of, wow, that really was surprising, but did you have an inkling of what was happening in the weeks leading up?
Yeah, and I think there's one more slide at the end, which is perfect because it answers this question. Yes, we had, the inkling was, the polling was very consistent all year of Trump, putting up these giant, relatively speaking, giant numbers with Hispanic voters, giant for a Republican, giant relative to what he'd done in the past, and obviously of enormous significance if it actually happened. Would it happen was the question. My test was Florida closes at 7, and Florida is fantastic at the efficiency of their vote reporting. So we didn't expect Florida to be a battleground state that we were going to be spending a ton of time on air on, but we knew we were going to get pretty full counts from some of these counties early. Osceola County, Florida, okay, is 54% Hispanic, and 1/3 of the entire county population, the majority of the Hispanic population, is Puerto Rican. And I felt this was a county where Trump he lost it by 25 points in 2016. He got it down to 2014 in 2020. And you're seeing all the polling. The question's out there, is this real, Trump and Hispanic voters? And then about a week before Election Day, Trump has that rally at Madison Square Garden. And if you remember, the big controversy that came out of that was the comedian, Puerto Rico comments. And I will tell you, the Democrats and the Harris campaign were adamant after that event that this had stopped everything that Trump was pulling off with Hispanic voters, especially with Puerto Rican voters. They are telling us that their people on the ground are seeing unbelievable movement. They're telling us, take a look. Where's there a large Puerto Rican population? We were thinking about, Pennsylvania's got a number of mid-sized cities, places like Reading, Allentown, with growing significant Puerto Rican populations. That was the suspense. Osceola was the test, because before we were going to get anything from Pennsylvania, Passaic, Lawrence, Mass, anywhere, we were going to get Osceola. Oh, I hope this is loaded. And here you go. So from 14 points for Biden, and I saw that at, 7:40 p.m. And when I saw that, I knew. I knew that's the test. If one of the most heavy concentrations of Puerto Rican voters anywhere in the country has now gone 16 points further in Trump's direction, this is real. This is not just happening there. This has got to be happening in Pennsylvania. And then once we see it in Pennsylvania, that's when I saw Passaic. I was like, well, wait a minute. This is outside the battleground. We see it in the Bronx. We saw it everywhere. So, one of
the you referenced it. A lot of folks in New Jersey, certainly in the New Jersey political universe, the focus is less on any federal election. The focus is on our very powerful office of the governor. And we have an open seat. Phil Murphy is term limited, can't run again. So we have a lot of top tier candidates on both sides angling to win the nomination. And the question comes up about, first of all, New Jersey, so it's easier to ask a national person like you because you have a sense of this state. How is the 2024 election results, how may or may not, they may or may not affect the 2025 election here in New Jersey?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I wish I was covering it again now. I wish this is going to be.
You can come back. It's all right.
This is going to be. I am fascinated by New Jersey, and it's a great test. Not just if you love New Jersey, if you live here in New Jersey politics. I think this is a great test nationally, because the theme of all of this, what we're sort of talking about here is, essentially the implication, if what Trump pulled off demographically, if what that Trump coalition was this time, sort of gels into something permanent and it grows a little bit. The implication is our conception of the battleground, our conception of what a swing state is going to change, and it's going to include New Jersey. There's a scenario where it could include like a New York State, depending on, but it's a huge if, and it's dependent on what I was just talking about with how much of this is just a Trump factor. So here we go. You're going to have a gubernatorial race in New Jersey. Now, Trump will be president, but obviously his name won't be on the ballot. Now, figure out the Republican primary here, because you could have a pretty anti-Trump candidate, potentially John Bramnick. I mean, if he was the nominee, I don't know how we'd interpret that, but I think it's a great test, because that was the biggest gain in any state for Republicans was what they pulled off. Any blue state was what they pulled off in New Jersey, and does that kind of lock in without Trump in a gubernatorial race? That's a powerful, powerful thing if that happens, and I think that the Republicans would be obviously joyous, and that would rattle. I mean, if that happens next year, the Democrats would be very, because exactly what I'm talking about, the fear that what happened with this Trump coalition is not just a Trump thing and that it gets worse. Yeah, it would be. Now, what Democrats have going for them in New Jersey is, when is the last time that the winner of the New Jersey governor's race, which is always the year after the presidential election, when's the last time the winner of that was from a party, opposite of who was in the White House? Well, it was 4 years ago with Phil Murphy, but remember, it was it was so much closer than expected. That was a very disappointing race. Before that, you got to go back like 40 years. So there is definitely an effect of one party controlling the presidency benefiting. This is true in Virginia too, largely benefiting the other party. So that trend versus what Trump just pulled off and the potential realignment, this is a great test of it.
We're all looking. I'm a kid in a candy store. I love this.
Should be.
It would seem that we no longer have an election day. We have an election season. People vote by mail certainly in this state 7 weeks before election day. Early in-person voting was obviously a big part of the Republican strategy to victory this year. You look at this stuff. Are there any trends that you're seeing about how Americans are voting these days? And does how a person vote, in person on election day, early in person, by mail, is how one votes make a difference for whom they vote?
Yeah, the vote by mail is still heavily Democratic, and it was in 2020. And obviously, because of COVID, there are a few states, Oregon, for instance, that have been doing vote by mail kind of universally for, Oregon started this in the late 1990s. So there are some states that are just, it's the culture of the state is vote by mail. But in a lot of places, obviously, this was brand new in 2020. And the dynamic of 2020 was Trump discouraging it, Democrats encouraging it. And, you saw like Democrats winning, Biden winning like 3/4 of the, Pennsylvania, he got 76%, Biden did, of the vote by mail in 2020. Now, this time around, Trump himself a little, but really Trump gave his okay to Republicans and his team to encourage mail-in voting this time around. And I think Republican voters themselves, Republican activists, kind of looked at what happened in 2020 and said, we got to get with this here. So the gap wasn't as pronounced, but it was still a Democratic advantage. I think the more notable thing about vote by mail was just overall the volume of vote by mail was down. It's one of the reasons why we actually got an outcome. What time did we call the election? 1:32 a.m. I don't know the exact time. I can't keep, my memories of election night are detached from the exact time things happen. But the point is we didn't go 5 days like we did back in 2020. And that was largely a function of the volume of vote by mail being much, much less this time. So they could process these votes, get results out much faster. Now, again, we didn't get our final votes counted until like yesterday. So could make an argument here. There's some work that can be done in these states. But I think the one I'm interested in is the public seems very interested in early in person. And I think that's one of these things that it expanded dramatically through COVID. And I think that's a very popular reform that's going to be institutionalized in a lot of states, expanded, that sort of thing. I wonder, though, there's all these sort of political battles, partisan battles around, what the exact voting laws in different states should be. I feel we're at a moment where that might be up for grabs in a way it hasn't been before, because a bit of what I just showed you, the way this has played out for the last 10, 20 years is that Democrats have had the perception, the belief that the bigger the electorate is, the better they do. This is why Democrats aggressively pushed vote by mail. This is why you could go back. There was the motor voter law. You remember this? You get your license, you're registered. Democrats have been behind these kinds of reforms, believing that the more voters you bring in that way, the better Democrats do. Republicans have believed that too. Republicans have believed these things benefit Democrats. So in a lot of cases, they've resisted these things. And that's been the stalemate between these parties. The coalition Trump put together was what you get from a broader electorate. If you looked at the exit poll, or if you look, you asked people about their interest level in the election, if you looked at people's, voting history, meaning like, did they vote in the last election or not? Trump did better in our final poll. If you had not voted in 2020, okay, Trump was winning those voters by 16 points. If you had not voted in both 2020 and 2022, in our poll, Trump was winning those voters by 22 points. That used to be, that kind of constituent, that kind of categorization used to be a Democratic advantage. So I think each party is changing as we speak, or questioning as we speak, those assumptions that have sort of undergirded how they approach voting laws and procedures. And so you've got these wild disparities between how different states do it. And I do wonder, this is a crazy thing to be saying in this era, right? But I do wonder if there's room for some kind of coming together here, a little bit more consensus between the states, because I think each party is not nearly as dug in on what works for them and what doesn't now.
When I was in high school, I was 14 or 15, I ran for the student council and I lost. And in my adult teenage mind, I thought my entire career in politics was over. My wise mother sat me down and told me that no one learns anything from winning. We've talked a lot about the Democrats and what they should be taking away from this election. Drawing on that piece of wisdom from my mom, what lessons should the Republicans be taking from this election?
Yeah, and I think I don't know if it's a lesson as much as I think there's that cautionary note, and there's that question, and there's that challenge. And there's there's limited evidence to me that Republicans have a good answer to this and a good sort of approach to it. And that is, again, the type of voter I was just describing, the one who, when you ask on a scale of 1 to 10, how interested are you in the election? Trump was doing well with the people who said 5 or 6. Harris did a little better with like the 10. The people who vote every election, midterm, school board, everything. Harris was doing better there. As I say, the people. So those types of voters, they're not that politically engaged day to day. Trump tapped into them. And the result, as we say here, is a coalition that defies so much of what we've thought of as the Republican coalition for generations now. And it's a coalition that, if it can be transported to other Republican candidates, other elections without Donald Trump, it's a very powerful coalition, especially if they can grow it just a little bit. But what are they doing? What are they doing to lock down? How are they understanding what motivated those voters, and what are they doing to bring those voters in more fully to the political process so that they do care about a midterm election? They do care about an election, a general election, even for president, where Donald Trump is not one of the candidates, or maybe isn't around at all. The closest thing to an answer, I think, is I think J.D. Vance has an idea of what it should be. J.D. Vance, believes, has tried to sort of, there's Trumpism as Trump expresses it, which is often, it's emotional, and it's kind of, it could be all over the place. J.D. Vance is a much more precise ideology that he's sort of developed here, but it's built around the idea that the Republican Party is now becoming, and should be, the working class party, that the Republican Party is becoming and now should be a more multiracial party that appeals, again, on the sort of cultural front, to a backlash to elitism, woke culture, whatever you want to call it, and appeals on the economic front, working class appeals. We're not going to touch the safety net. We're not going to touch Medicare. We're not going to touch Social Security. We're actually okay with unions. J.D. Vance went and walked a picket line in Ohio this year. Those sorts of things that were unthinkable for Republicans before. Vance, to me, is potentially an interesting test. I know Trump's last vice president didn't emerge with much of a political future, but if Vance remains in the good graces of Trump, I think, he did himself a lot of favors with Republican voters this campaign. I think he won a lot of fans among Republican voters this campaign. And going way ahead here, in my mind, I'm sort of thinking there's a logical path for him to be the nominee in 26, and it could be a test of exactly what we're talking about here. Can he create an ideology? Can he create a platform that works without Trump? It's a big if, and I think Republicans have to be thinking about that, because none of this matters if it's Trump only.
We got a few more questions we're just trying to get through here. The moment the 2024 election race was decided, or at least was called, because it was kind of officially over last week, when the last House race was finally called. But the moment the 2024 election presidential race was decided, the battle for 2026 and the midterm elections in Congress began. So we had questions that came in about the midterm elections and what we should expect. So I want to ask you about the House of Representatives first. Republicans now have the smallest margin in history. They face immediate challenges because several Republican House members are being nominated by Trump to leave their seat and to go serve in the administration. Typically, in a midterm election, which will be 2026, the party in the White House does poorly. And further, Democrats have been doing in these special elections, that's where Democrats and those people who are in the 9 or 10 on the scale of interest really come out, and the Democrats have been doing quite well there. All of this would seem that the Democrats should be excited for 2026. Should they?
Well, they should be. If I were a Democrat, I'd be looking at 2026 and being at least cautiously optimistic. Because again, not to be a broken record, but is this Trump coalition going to show up as part of it? And then, yes, that's the other part. The Democratic coalition has become think about this. One of the reasons when you talk to Democrats during this campaign, and you say, why is Harris going to win? Or when he was in, why was Biden going to win? One of the things they would come back and tell you is, well, haven't you seen all the special elections? Remember Tom Suozzi on Long Island, special election for Congress, February of this year. That was when George Santos, if you remember, resigned his seat, special election. And here, Tom Suozzi, the Democrat, wins the special election by 8 points. There were races like that. Democrats seemed unbeatable in these high-profile special elections. And Democrats said, well, there, you're seeing, forget these polls. This is what voters are actually doing when they get a chance. What was happening there and what was happening in all these special elections was, in a special election, obviously, you're not going to have turnout level nearly what you're going to get in a presidential election. We had nearly 160 million people vote in this. In a special election, it's who's going to go out on a night like this to vote for that kind of thing. Democrats have a clear advantage there right now. Now, if they can maintain that advantage, in a midterm environment, especially with a Republican in the White House and the backlash potential there, that's huge for them. But the two ifs would be, number one, I have this question. There's a little bit. We haven't done a lot of polling on it, but there's a little bit. The Democratic base, that vote every election base, has been very animated the last 8 years. How are they feeling after this election? How are they feeling? Maybe not right now, 6 months from now. Is that intensity of engagement, which has been off the charts since Election Day 2016, does that continue? Or just some of these voters it's been 8 years, how much they put into it, and some of them just kind of, without even consciously deciding it, kind of go back to their lives before Trump, and it is what it is. I'll never like Trump, but it is what it is. Did the Democrats lose some of that energy, some of that edge with Trump having beaten them, this time around? There's that. And then the second thing, the second cautionary note would just be, yes, historically, the midterm is the opposition party wins and often wins very big. But now we've had, Democrats lost the House in 2022 and lose that many seats. Say the Republicans are sitting here with 220 now. They'd been at, 222 before, and they were down at 212 before that. So now really 3 straight elections, the House has been in this extremely narrow range. Where we'd been before was, 63 seats for the Republicans in 2010. Now you bounce back and it's a dozen for the Democrats in 2012. We haven't had those big swings now. And it does raise the question too, about how much has this sorted itself out a bit here, where there's just, again, there's a longer term trend here of, are there fewer swing voters and more people are just dug in with one party or the other, and you don't get those big fluctuations. So
that was the House. The Senate is also up. Republicans have 53 out of the 100 seats. In 2026, Republicans, I believe, will have 20 seats to defend. Democrats have 13. How would you assess each side's chances of either maintaining or taking control of the Senate?
You would say right now the Republicans are feeling good about their majority in 2026 in the Senate. They do have more seats to defend. A lot of those seats are, on paper, certainly very defendable. The one, listen, this is the white whale for Democrats, is Susan Collins in Maine. They've thought they've had her 3 times now or something. They really thought they had her in 2020. And she actually won fairly easily, but obviously she'll be the number one target, I think, of Democrats. And that one is it's shaky. Just give it to blue state still, even though Trump won a congressional district there. But again, you could look at, cases in the past where, trying to think of the best example of this. 2000. I mean, you got to go back a little bit of a ways here. But when George W. Bush was reelected in 2004, you looked at the Senate then. Republicans had, I think, 56 seats in the Senate, and you looked at the map for 2006, and it was, Democrats are now winning, Missouri, and they did. The atmosphere shifted that much between 2004, when it was despair among Democrats, and when Karl Rove was saying 40-year Republican majority, in 2006, when the Democrats took the Senate back. So that's the hope for Democrats. Intervening events create that kind of atmosphere.
We want to get to our last 2 questions. They're a little bit lighter, so I'm just preparing you. Because when you walked in tonight, there were some folks in the audience who were milling around, came in. You took a moment to go off, And the one person turned to the other and said, he's not wearing khakis. It was a legitimate, I am quoting her directly, everything. So I kid you not, we got 3 questions about this. I just said, well, we've got to ask about this. Because apparently, and I was not noticing this, but apparently on election night, you did not wear tan khakis. You wore a darker color.
Yeah.
And there are those, I won't want to call them conspiracy advocates, but they actually believe you jinxed the Democratic Party because you decided to change the wardrobe that they had come to believe in. So for the record, because we're recording this, and just to clear the air, was there any particular reason why you switched from tan to blue?
Those are some powerful pants, huh? I tell you, there was at no point until 2020 in my entire life, probably my social life too, had anybody ever asked me about my pants. So I never understood it. And it was not the whole thing with the khakis in 2020, it was not a planned thing. It was not meant as a gimmick. I didn't think I never thought anybody would notice, and I gave almost no thought to it. It was just, it was about time to go on the air, and they were there, so I wore them. And so I guess it's a long way to say, I never felt like this. I think I would hear from people who'd be like, oh, you love your khaki pants. No, they're actually kind of uncomfortable. I don't know. So I just, I started to wear stuff like this. These are, I don't know what they're called. I'm talking about fashion. This is ridiculous. And he's just much more comfortable. So I was like, why do I have to wear these every time? But I tell you, like, it was, of all the things, I took you through the whole process of preparation and the stress and the anxiety. And it is exactly that. It's the more you study, the more you realize how much you don't know. And then I had more anxiety leading up to this election than any I've ever done, because I was more aware of what I didn't know this time around. And it'll probably be worse in 2026. But amidst all that anxiety, all that preparation, I had to sit down with my producer like the day before the election and bring somebody from our PR department in and say, is it okay if I wear these on the air? And we had a 20-minute conversation. And I said yes.
Our closing question, especially for the young students in this room tonight, they have a question that they talk about often, is whether any of this thing called politics, with its endless negativity, its unseemly compromises, is even worth it. So if a young person comes up to you and asks, why should I get involved in politics at all? How would you respond? Make it better.
I mean, I don't disagree. Where it is right now is, everybody here probably feels it, right? I mean, I don't need to describe it. We've all lived it. And, that's the top question I would get when the book I came out with, 6 years ago is about the political divide. And so obviously every event I did would be, well, how do you get out of it? And I was like, I don't have the answer. I said, but I felt that there is something deep in us as humans that led to it. I think that we're in political tribalism. I think tribalism is deep within us, but I think there's something also that's deeply human, and that is sort of endless ingenuity. So, people, I'm probably at the age now where I can indict my own generation. People my age and older maybe have kind of dropped the ball on this and got us in the mess, but take up the torch. Show us the way,
On that note, the person who showed us the way, Steve Kornacki, ladies and gentlemen.